Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony J. Algman. Data's everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. We've partnered with Dataversity to provide listeners with 20% off your first training center purchase with promo code ALGMANDL. Go to dataleadershiptraining.com to learn more. Today, on episode 88, we welcome Abhishek Nayak. As co-founder and CEO of 4 startups, one of which was funded by Sequoia Capital, Abhishek is well-versed in the art of the startup. Abhishek and 2 co-founders created Appsmith to put customizable app tools directly into developers' hands. The once small open-source project is now used by over 1,000 teams, employs people in 8 countries, and has raised over $10 million in capital. Abhishek, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you about data and how do we become data leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're excited to have you. And you've got a great story to share with the audience. So why don't you just give us, like we do with all our first-time guests, just get us started with, give us a little bit of a story overview of your career and how some of those earlier experiences have led up to what you're doing now.
Sounds great. So I've been an entrepreneur since 2011. That's when I graduated from college. And I actually studied biological sciences, but my heart wasn't in the lab, and I decided to go do a startup. And my first startup was very focused on providing cash on delivery as a payment service. In India, till date, 50% of transactions that happen are actually paid for through cash. You get the e-commerce product.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's something that surprises people, but India is a country where still a lot of people aren't trusting of internet companies. So they wanted to pay by cash. So that's the company that I started right out of college. And this was sort of mostly an offline business, but we had important elements like APIs so that we could provide a real-time status, an application so that our people who were collecting cash, they could update status, all of that. The most important thing in payments is to ensure that data is immutable. It's exactly what you say it is, and it's reflected all the time, everywhere. So getting the reliability right was, I remember, an important challenge for us, especially when you're working on mobile networks. So that was an interesting challenge. So with that startup, we ran that for 2.5 years. We exited that startup by selling it to a larger player who then scaled it. And after that, I spent about a year working at the startup that had acquired us. And there I was heading product. This startup was again in the business of payments, and they were creating a mobile device that could accept payments anywhere, to be used by restaurants, to be used at petrol stations, gas stations, or retailers, etc. So there I headed product, and that was the first time where I actually started dealing with data from hardware. Because every device was a sort of like an IoT device, and that again had data. The one thing that we had to deal with was with that data, transferring that over Bluetooth used to be really slow and painful. So we had to figure out how do we optimize sending of that data and ensure we are getting everything we need, but even though the bit rates were quite low there. So that's the place that I worked. I worked there for a year, but after that I again wanted to do a startup. And then I did a startup which was called Bicycle AI. Basically, I was focused on automating customer support conversations. This was in 2016, where AI was just beginning to take off, and me and my co-founder had been looking at ML and AI for a little bit. My co-founder especially had spent a lot of time automating voice conversations and trying to automatically generate voice as well as understand anything that's said through voice. So he was very interested in automating customer support. So that's the place where we ended up dealing with a lot of data, because we were taking data from large consumer startups in India and in the US and converting their conversations into a bot that could automatically try to reply or triage the actual query that came in if they couldn't reply automatically. In most cases, our reply accuracy rate was about 1 out of 4. So it was, accurate 25% of the time, and wrong 75% of the time. So we used that as a tool that was augmenting the support agent instead of replacing them completely. So the support agent would get all the suggested responses, and they would then click and actually send a reply to the customer. So this was very focused on ensuring we could solve that one problem really well. And for that, we just had to collect as much data as possible of conversations, of online English material, so that we could have an understanding of grammar, so that we could understand sentence structures and actually try to construct a reply in cases where there was no reply. Now, with this startup, it took us a long time to get something that was usable by customers, but it never got the job done that well. And we would always have customers churning out because the accuracy was simply not there with those conversations. It's been nearly 4 years since I worked on it, but even looking at the state today, I don't think it's possible to automate all conversations of those kinds. So we ended up stopping our work on that and actually decided to just do a totally different startup. That was a gaming startup that I did right after that for a really short period. Wasn't really data heavy, but we had around 120,000 daily active users playing games on the application. And at any point in time, we would have 40,000 people active on the app. So that was a very high scale consumer app. And there we didn't do much data analytics except for figuring out why things were slow or why certain users were unable to reply in the right amount of time or play the game in the right amount of time, because it was a real-time game. So we spent a lot of time there, and that was the startup where we actually dealt with problems around CRUD applications or internal admin panels that ended up becoming Appsmith. Because at this game startup, we ended up building a lot of interfaces to update and deal with customer data. So for example, customers would request us to update their phone number or their address or their payment method, and we had to do that automatically on the backend. So we couldn't do that automatically on the backend, so we had to build interfaces to update that data in the database. We also built interfaces to create levels in the game and modify levels in the game. That again, was like an internal app that we built. So this was the place where my co-founder Arpit, who has worked with me at all the startups that I've spoken about, he started toying with the idea of building a UI builder that makes it really easy for a business user to run CRUD operations on any database. Create, read, update, delete operations, and these operations tend to form the core of any enterprise application. So this startup was sort of the genesis of that idea. Now, even though Arpit had this idea right when we were doing this startup, we still decided to not pursue this full time till we got just better at understanding the problem. So both of us ended up working at different companies. I ended up joining Excel Partners in India as an entrepreneur in residence, and Arpit joined another startup as a director of engineering. So that was sort of the precursor to the work that we did before starting Appsmith today.
Got it. And so tell me a little bit more about Appsmith and what it actually entails. I have a couple questions in mind, but I want to give a little bit more background to folks before I start peppering the questions with you.
Sounds good. So Appsmith is an open source framework that's used by developers to build all sorts of CRUD applications and internal admin panels and workflow tools so that a company can run its business. A lot of these tools look like customer support dashboards, where a customer support agent can go in and look up all the details of that particular customer. They should also be able to trigger maybe refunds or trigger reshipping of a particular product if you're an e-commerce company. Or you could have a sales dashboard where you're tracking customer data, you're trying to figure out all the actions that a customer has taken so that you can have an informed sales conversation with that customer. Or it could be an operations dashboard for a warehouse where you're managing your inventory of the warehouse, you're tracking all the vehicles that are coming in, all the shipments that are going out, and all sorts of tools. So Appsmith is a very flexible tool, but the common thing with everything that is built is it always talks to a database or an API, and there's always a human who's running some sort of data operations. They're either viewing data or updating, deleting, or creating new data. So that's the common thing.
Interesting. So help me really understand this. So it sounds to me a bit like a kind of WYSIWYG editor for kind of web pages or what have you, but it sounds like it has a much more sophisticated data component underneath it to facilitate the actual model or the like you said, the CRUD operations for interacting with that database more so than just focusing on the interface. Is that correct, or am I missing something?
That's right. The most important thing in an application like this is the source of data. So with Appsmith, you can connect it with any API, GraphQL, REST APIs, or you can even connect it to Snowflake or Postgres, MongoDB, etc. And you can run native queries on those data stores. So you can run a native Mongo query and query the MongoDB. Maybe you do not have an API ready for it yet. The other thing that you can do in Appsmith is you can write JavaScript anywhere. So you can write all your data transformation logic in JavaScript. And therefore you can combine two different data sources and display the transformed data in a single table or like a list or some other means. So the fact that you can connect with any data store and you can transform the response that comes from it and then visualize it in a UI, that's the bit that's very powerful.
So I'm interested in the notion of being able to pull in data from multiple sources. It's really kind of nice. I assume, are you doing the computation layer of that on the server side or the client side? Because I have to imagine that would be a pretty heavy lift on the client side, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so today we do it mostly on the client side.
It is.
Over time, we are working towards moving some of that computation onto the server side. So
there's a limit to what. Yeah, that makes sense. So for simple operations, if you're looking at different records, like, hey, I want to, and for your use case, it makes sense, because if I wanted to like self-administer my account information that's pulling from 3 internal systems, and we need to be able to provide that access layer to do that, this could pull from those systems. I don't really have a huge computational load because it's probably only pulling back single records, maybe a handful of records or something. And so really the data IO component is not going to be too much, and then you're able to make the changes you need to and then propagate it back to the respective systems that you're updating appropriately. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So small workloads can be handled really easily in Appsmith, but for larger workloads, it might make sense to have some sort of an analytics API in between, so that the computation is actually being done by that. But one of the things that we will be introducing in the future is ability to do a lot of this compute on the server side, and that's definitely on our roadmap. But as of today, we are definitely focused on doing it on the client side.
Okay, and so the question that I imagine is in other people's minds as well. So you've created this as a open source framework. Is an appropriate, or is it an open source application?
So yeah, it's an open source framework.
Okay. What's the business model there? Like, how do you create a business around an open source framework, and where do people that are interested in this, how does your business exist? Because I think this is a common pattern, and I think we're often just forgetting that there are businesses behind this that need real resources to do what they do. How do you provide that, and where does the customer actually pay for the value that they're getting from that?
Sure. So the idea with the open source project is to ensure that a lot more people have access to the project, because the best thing about open source is the code is all public and anybody can contribute back. So the more users you have, the better your product naturally gets, the better the project gets. And the other thing about open source is that it works really well when your market is really large and there are lots of people who need this. Because most open source projects only monetize anywhere from 1% to maybe like 5% of their user base. And that's certainly going to be the case with Appsmith. But the 1% or 2% user base which ends up paying for an open source project, they end up paying quite a bit because they tend to be mid to large companies who have a real budget and they need things which the average open source user doesn't need. So they need more things around data security, around developer environments, and all sorts of customizations to the UI that an average small company might not need that. So the open source project works really well for small to, like early mid-sized companies, but mid to large companies require certain features which are provided as an additional feature set on top of the open source project. So that's the way we monetize.
And for those of you out there listening that are maybe less technical, haven't contributed to open source projects or what have you directly, it's the benefit there is like Abhishek said, it gives the ability to access pretty powerful tools to those small and early mid-sized businesses that can't afford the cash to buy a lot of enterprise grade applications. And then as they grow bigger, they may get higher levels of that or have higher needs, which is certainly helpful. But the benefit to the company that's producing these is that they really increase the opportunities of the development of the application or of the framework, is that there's a whole bunch of opportunities for people who need something that doesn't exist today to go and build it and then contribute it back and make the platform better, make the framework better and more comprehensively useful. So there's benefits on both sides that then leads to even more capable frameworks for those larger organizations that can actually demand, in many cases, to pay for it because they need that security or that comfort that comes with those service level agreements, and that they have somebody to call or what have you, because they're probably, when you're working in large organizations, you may not have the internal staff always to be experts in every tool that you have. You may have a lot of tools floating about, and you need to be able to call that vendor as an expert in that to say, hey, we are trying to do this thing, or this isn't working the right way. How do we do that? That may be an opportunity, again, for the open source community to contribute functionality back. And that's the kind of thing that creates these ecosystems that grow very well. Abhishek, do you have anything to add to that, or did I oversimplify those dynamics?
No, I think you've gotten it exactly right. Open source projects, they create a lot more value than they capture versus a traditional proprietary company. And I think that's great because without open source software, a lot of things that we use today would not be possible. And I see Appsmith as one of those things which I can see will stand the test of time and last a long time because it's open source. Versus if it was proprietary and only available to a few companies, one, it wouldn't be a great product because you don't have so many users using it. But also second, a large part of the world would be without these tools, and therefore they, wouldn't be able to do more cool things that can come after a product like Appsmith exists. So I'm really excited to see what happens beyond that. We already have companies which have built products on top of Appsmith's open source project. So that's been interesting as well.
Isn't that a cool feeling when you've built something and then other people have taken it and then just really created something amazing on top of it? That's always a good feeling in really any context, but especially when you have a product that you've brought to market that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is one corollary question that I should ask here, because like we were talking about the benefits of open source, especially as it pertains to those paying customers, which are a small percentage of the overall, there's still a fear out there, and I'm sure this is not the first time you've heard this, but there's a fear out there from those enterprises or other large organizations that because it's open source, it may potentially have a higher degree of risk because it's not, created by and for an enterprise, and it's not locked down. It has, open source. So does that make it more vulnerable? How do you respond to that?
Most open source project tends to be more secure than others because the code base is accessible to everybody. It just gets a lot more eyes. So we get a lot of security reports from our users, and that wouldn't have happened if they didn't have access to the code base. So that tends to be secure. One thing that's right in something that you mentioned is open source project, when they're first built, they're generally built for small teams, and over time they evolve to serve larger companies. Mm-hmm. It's rare that it starts off first with serving a larger company's need and then serves smaller teams. So there are a few cases of it, but most cases they start small. So that's definitely the case. And every time you're evaluating an open source project, you have to figure out if it's enterprise ready or not. Do they have all those things thought through? Do they have the right SLAs? Do they have the right security certifications? So those things matter, and that's something we are in the process of getting for Appsmith. Not everything, but as much as possible.
Well, and that kind of shows too why the pattern of cash flows in startups are what they are. They tend to be, money losers for quite a while as they're building out that core capability set, delivering to an audience that is interested but doesn't necessarily have a lot of cash to invest themselves, but have time and can make that product better. And that's where you see the rapid growth of some of those applications or frameworks that have struck a chord in that open source community get a tremendous amount of interest and usage. And then the question becomes, can you take that and turn that corner into a monetizable, higher grade platform that is relevant to larger scale businesses? And that's one of those kind of critical milestones in the journey of any startup software or technology type of enterprise. Can you make that turn to where now you can start to actually achieve some of those inflow from cash because you've reached a certain critical mass? Because nobody's going to pay a lot of money for an idea. They need something that actually works and delivers value for them.
Exactly. And talking about growth of open source project, when you introduced me, I know you read the bio of Appsmith where you said 1,000 companies use it. But this bio was actually written 4 months ago, and today we have around 7,000 teams that use Appsmith every month. So it's just like 7x growth in a short period. So we can see that there's a flywheel that comes when you're using an open source project. As it gets better, more people hear about it, more people use it, and it just creates a larger base. And therefore, I'm very confident that Appsmith can actually generate a lot of revenue from a small percentage, but actually continue to support and fund this public good that anybody can use and anybody can modify.
Well, and that's part of, in my opinion anyway, the part of a lot of good businesses is that you're first thinking about what is that challenge that you're trying to solve? What is that headache that you're trying to alleviate for the broader community? And if you can solve that well, then you're well on the path to something that can also make money. I'm disheartened sometimes where people are like, how can I somehow manipulate the game to try to make money without actually delivering something of real value? And that's always disheartening because there's plenty of those options, those organizations out there as well. But I think over time they kind of quickly show what they're really made of, and that kind of growth, like that's one of those key indicators, right? Where you have a 7x growth over just a couple of months. Now we're seeing something that people don't go and spend their time even on things that aren't valuable. So having that kind of growth in the community is a great indicator, like, yes, you are on to something. Can you give us like an example of some of what your early adopters are doing and like building with the framework or putting into their organizations? Like, how has it helped create change for those organizations that are these relatively early adopters?
So a lot of our early adopters, so one example of an early adopter is a fintech startup that built an entire KYC workflow in Appsmith. So they provide loans to customers, and they find customers through their mobile app. So customers upload their data and it goes through a KYC workflow that is built on Appsmith, where multiple people review the information, and then finally one person approves that the customer is ready for a loan. So that entire workflow has been built on Appsmith. So that's something that we've seen in crypto startups as well as fintech startups. The KYC workflows. The other thing that's been really common are customer support dashboards, where you're extending maybe HubSpot or Zendesk or some other place where you're having customer conversations. You're extending that through tools where you're able to look at more data about a customer. Today, for example, for you to talk to a customer of an e-commerce startup, you really need all information about the delivery status, the payment status. You need ability to change the delivery dates or maybe refund a customer. All the service providers that you use, they might give you APIs, and using Appsmith, it's really easy to build the interface to run these sort of operations. The third thing that's common is also like data dashboards, but these will be data dashboards with a way to modify the data that you're seeing. Traditionally, dashboards are difficult to change. You want to change a particular chart. you might have to copy it and then access the edit version of it. Versus if you have an interface which can let you just change the charts that are there or add filters of your own very easily without needing to understand a query language, that's again powerful, and that's a very common use case in Appsmith.
That's really interesting. I can think of a few different examples in my own day job where this would be useful because, like your point, I love APIs. I think they're great, but there's so many that you need another layer now to kind of help manage some of those flows in an even more consistent way because you may be using so many of these different APIs, and the challenge in these larger organizations tends to be around access and authentication, and also how are we maintaining the right governance controls of things, and some of the challenges around data use and privacy and all of those things. It's just having a place where we can kind of control some of these things in a coherent manner across a bunch of different sources and have bi-directional data flows happening with that. Not just, hey, I'm populating a dashboard and we're going to read from that, but now all of a sudden we can use that, change information, have that two-way communications with underlying data sources. Obviously, it brings up other potential challenges with things like operational systems or what have you. You're not going to be able to go in and say, oh, I don't like this data, and change the data in an operational system. There's going to be controls around that. But where it's appropriate, you certainly can have a distributed data model on the back end across different systems that need account information. And this may be, if I put on my data management hat, this actually could be a really useful tool for the data managers and the data governance folks out there, because we could start to coalesce master data sets more incrementally than a pure like command and control master data program. This gives us a chance to kind of see things, look at patterns, make a determination, and then have the option to bring things back, because it's kind of a programming dynamic where you can build on top of that with what your organization needs. This is interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think you covered really good examples. One of the most interesting things about what we've seen in our enterprise conversations has been they care a lot about who can access what, and they also want an audit trail. And if you are building these things on your own, it's really difficult to build like an audit trail for your own internal dashboard or your internal tool. But with Appsmith, it comes along with the framework. And that I think is a sign that companies want to give access to these data stores to more people, and that's the reason they're looking for all these checks and balances. And it just means more people will have access to data to get their job done, which I think is just great. Everybody will be a lot more efficient.
Yeah, and it gives some flexibility for different folks, different groups of people to use tooling that they are familiar with, and interfaces that are custom designed for them, while still sharing a common data layer underneath. I also think there may be application for event-driven processing dynamics or orchestration, like larger scale data pipelines with some of the server-side stuff that you're working on. I'm thinking about, I have workloads that could, maybe they currently run in AWS, but I may have idle computational horsepower on my on-premises environments that is just sunk cost. Why not be able to execute some of that? And if I want to start bouncing in a multi-cloud strategy, executing workloads dynamically across different cloud or on-premises environments, the native event handling of a single cloud architecture isn't exactly what I want to be able to have. I want to have something that can also work distributed and run that orchestration from any place too, because maybe it's the orchestration that I want to run in a particular country because of other concerns around access or security or what have you. This just gives you extra flexibility that's agnostic to the computational and data layer and the physical infrastructure side that just put that decision process in your hands. Now, that also, and if I'm misstating anything, let me know. But like because it also then presupposes you have at least enough technical development sophistication to know what you want to do, because some other easy buttons that exist out there will just say, oh, just run it this way. And I think that's one of the benefits of the cloud. I made a joke the other day. I'm like, the cloud is really good at helping you turn things on, but it's not necessarily as good helping you know what you're about to spend or how to turn things off. And that means there's a lot of ways to get things done, but not necessarily the operational controls or the rigor around how do you manage this for your business day in and day out when there's real money, real costs involved. So I find this this kind of framework gives you flexibility that a specific cloud native service may not. Is that one of the use cases for this framework as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of our users host Appsmith in a cloud environment. It could be AWS, Azure, but they're almost always self-hosting it. And the main thing around operational costs that happens when you bring in Appsmith is number one, you can build a tool that you need really quickly because everything happens, 10x faster. You can also hire external consultants to come build these things out. That's something we see a lot of companies doing. You just run a project for a few months and you get the tool that you need, and you don't need to spend money on engineering anymore because you have a tool that's working. So that's something that we've also seen. The other thing that it does, if you do have technical team members, instead of needing multiple team members to help you build something like this, you just need one person who understands the data really well. That's all. If this person can write SQL queries, they can build all sorts of applications in Appsmith already. So what this means is you don't even need a proper engineer to build things on Appsmith. So you can just have a smart product manager or somebody who understands SQL really well.
Well, and especially for those small and mid-sized businesses, like they aren't going to have the deep specialists a lot of the time. They're going to have generalist technology people that may know SQL, may know Python, maybe dabble in Java or something like that. But you're providing a wrapper around that and these kinds of graphical tools to help them get to interfaces and just get the job done in a way that for 90% of the workloads out there, they don't have to be perfectly optimized to the bit level to maintain costs. They just need to get things done relatively quickly. So that's where like frameworks have a small but non-zero amount of overhead or amount of inefficiencies built into them. But the benefit is that it allows for much more rapid development. And in being able to do that with a skill set that is more generalist versus specialist, or you're able to pull in, hey, we have something really complicated. There's only one person who knows that technical piece of it. Let them focus on just that technical piece of it. We can wrap around that with Appsmith and be able to just plug that into the rest of the ecosystem without asking them, hey, build this from front to back, because we don't have any other mechanism to plug that in. Does that resonate as well? Is that a correct use?
Yes. That's absolutely right. Having generalists being able to work on these things generally means you're able to move a lot faster. That's the main thing. And the best engineering generalists, they're just focused on getting the job done and ensuring they're able to deliver value to a customer. They're not worried about how it's done. And they are generally the ones who end up adopting Appsmith quite quickly. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen tech-first companies adopt Appsmith very early versus companies which are more laggards. They've taken a little bit of time to adopt, for sure. But the tech-first companies, people who already have access to a lot of engineering talent, they end up seeing the value a lot because now they realize they don't need to hire so many more engineers. And that's been interesting. Versus people who are a little bit of a laggard, they might assume these things are more complicated and therefore we need a larger engineering team and a much larger budget to achieve it. What they don't realize is the tools already exist. You'll be able to get things that you thought might take a year done in about a month. And that's something that has been amazing to see.
I've had previous episodes that we've had people that have like really specific like low code or no code solutions that they're working on, and those are really interesting. Would you put this in that category of low code or no code, or is this really about like encapsulating code or encapsulating that logic with whatever wrapper you need to help facilitate that workflow management? I'm not sure I know the answer to this one. That's why I asked.
So I would put it in low code. It definitely is something that helps you build things very, very rapidly while writing lesser code. So this is low code, and in the past 20 years, there's always been new low code frameworks that have emerged. It's just that they've been named today. If you think about it, even something like Tableau is a low code framework because it just
Mm-hmm.
made so many things easier for us. Tableau, Looker, or Metabase, they're all low code products.
Mm-hmm.
And in some way, Appsmith is just the next level after they existed. In other ways, Appsmith is just it's a historical tech trend that we are
Mm-hmm.
sort of bringing back because Appsmith is very similar to Visual Basic or Delphi.
Mm.
These were products that were very popular, in late 90s and early 2000s. But when the web came forward, these tools stopped being relevant. And Appsmith can be considered as a Visual Basic, but for the web. So that's again something that's that. So in a way, we are new, but in a lot of ways, we are actually just ancient. So,
Well, you've struck a chord with me because I particularly appreciate the role that Visual Basic played. I very early in my career, I learned to code in the workplace. I'd had computer science classes and stuff in school, but I learned to code in the workplace using Visual Basic scripts in Excel, which led to more proper Visual Basic and then bigger applications and all that. So that resonates with me, and it the parallel is clearly there where you're about that integration across this entire stack and about making things easier to connect. You're not about trying to come up with necessarily the most perfect and elegant solution. You have a pragmatic aspect to it and an ease of use aspect to it that you're trying to apply now in the world of web development and web programming. That is certainly a useful construct. That is certainly a useful mission to have. I would think because it's still it's still difficult to bounce between things without some relative pain on the back end. So that I think is really really cool. I like that analogy a lot. The VB thing that resonates with me a lot.
yeah, I also learned programming on VB6. So I remember that product really well and how accessible it made building applications. I think before you actually start building something, you feel it's just going to take you a lot longer and it's a lot tougher. But when you get into it, you realize, okay, this can be figured out. You follow the tutorials first, and then you keep moving upwards, and one day you can actually build everything that you need.
Oh, you're bringing me back now. I remember having conversations with people who would tell me they're like, "Oh, I'm not very technical or whatever," but then I would see stuff that they built in Excel using VB scripts or even Access databases or whatever, and they would not necessarily be brilliant from like an engineering perspective, but they would get an amazing amount of stuff done. And I'm like, "You are very technical. You just don't realize you have a limited tool set to work with. If you expand that, your power will exponentially increase." But it's such a great avenue, and I think this is the role that Appsmith is also playing. Is it's an onboarding to becoming more technical and becoming more savvy, especially with many organizations like. We don't have the budgets for bringing in super deep technical benches. We just got to scrape together what we can in those early days and find ways where getting multiple people or more people involved in that solution making is really, really valuable. So I really appreciate, thinking about this that way because that's a huge value add. No wonder you're getting such growth in uptake with this. And hopefully by being on shows like this, it helps you reach even more folks that are like, wow, I could really use this. Then let me go experiment. Hey, this isn't as bad as I thought. And they're off to the races. And so that's really fantastic. It's great to see, you having that kind of impact with this framework that you're building.
Yeah, I think both of us seem to have had a similar background where we started with simplistic programs, and over time we moved to more technical leadership positions where we might not be coding, but we understand code, and that's why it helps us do our job really well. And yeah, you're absolutely right. More people, if they tried products like this, they would realize it's not that hard. It does take a little bit of time at the start, but there's enough help out there that's gonna get you started very quickly with Appsmith or really any other similar low code product out there.
It's great advice. Don't be intimidated, even though we get it. Like it's intimidating to try something new or to learn about a new framework or new application that you haven't seen before. But if you do and just dabble into it, explore a little bit, you might be surprised at how accessible these can really be and how much power you unlock by really getting involved with them. So I think we're going to need to leave it at that. Because we're just about out of time. Before we go, what's the best way for folks out there to find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn or you can find me on Twitter. My email is abhishek@appsmith.com. So you can also write to me there.
Perfect. Abhishek, thank you so much for being on the show today. This is really interesting stuff.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It was lovely chatting with you.
And thank you all for joining us today. As always, you'll find more information, all the links in the show notes. Go to dataleadershiplessons.com to subscribe and check out past episodes and accelerate your journey with training at dataleadershiptraining.com. Stay safe during these unusual times and go make an impact.